torture methods used at the Spanish Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition was originally initiated by the monarchy to rid the Spain of heresy while overpowering the country's people through barbaric treatment that would instill tremendous fear. Here are 6 torture methods used during the Spanish Inquisition that were used to force people to confess to crimes they were innocent of, as well as causing pain and suffering. Please continue to support my channel by subscribing. The Catholic Church punished the Spanish people for religious crimes, and due to the growing population of Jews in the country, they were under intense scrutiny by fascists who took barbaric steps to convert Jews and Muslims to Christianity. Those that agreed to convert were under increased suspicion and prejudice, while those that didn't were killed. The choice was baptism or death. At the peak of the trouble in Spain, an estimated 32,000 executions were carried out over a period of 200 years. Inquisitors would reach a town where they would be looking for the people to confess to heresy. Some people would admit to their crimes and would come away with smaller punishments, such as whipping or pilgrimage. But those that did not confess were tortured and executed. There were hundreds of miscarriages of justice. Many of the accused were innocent of all alleged crime, but were executed regardless, due to not being allowed to defend themselves. During the Spanish Inquisition, the hairshirt was used after a confession, whether it was voluntary or forced through torture. Those that wore the hairshirt would repent and apologize to God for their sins, and devote themselves to God, Jesus, and the Church. They would then be ordered to wear this shirt in public for the ultimate humiliation, to show them that they had been charged with a religious crime. It was also used to deter others, especially in hot weather, where it became an unbearable torture method. The shirt was made out of animal hair and would have had an opening for the neck, and it would sit on the shoulders. The skin would be irritated and the people would suffer from incredible discomfort. Sometimes the irritation would be made worse with stones and tree branches. Sometimes those ordered to wear the hairshirt would also go without eating food or water to further their punishment. The length of time a person would be forced to wear the shirt was variable, but some would be forced to wear it for a week in their homes, while others would be made to wear it on a hot day in public in the sweltering sun. Another method used during this period of time was the rack. The rack was a brutal device that is famously used to ensure a confession was gained through excruciating agony. The individual would be tied to a wooden board with their arms and legs secured by a rope, chains, or cuffs. These would then be tied to a revolving crank at each end of the rack. Each time the rack was turned, the arms and legs would begin to stretch. The body would start to tighten before joints dislocated and popped out of their sockets, before ligaments and tendons snapped. Bones would also snap through the skin, which would conjure agonizing screams from the victim. The rack would stretch the muscles so far that when the victim was released afterwards, they simply would not go back to their original state. This would make it extremely difficult to walk or move the limbs afterwards. Another form of torture used to inflict pain and torture on an alleged criminal was a bed of nails. The prisoner would be forced to lay bare-skinned onto a bed of nails. Alongside this, their hands and toenails would also be removed, or their skin would be punctured with nails and other sharp objects, causing detrimental bleeding that often led to death. The Spanish Inquisition also used a strappado alongside the rack. This method had 3 different variations. Firstly, the accused would have their hands and ankles tied behind their backs with rope, which would be fed through a pulley system, and as they were pulled off the ground, they were left suspended in the air, hanging. This would often dislocate their bones, and the shoulders would often pop first. As the pain would continue, the victims would struggle, which would only inflict further pain on them. With this method, additional weight could be added to make the process quicker and more painful. This type of torture was enough to deter people from committing any crimes during these times. Those that were subject to this barbaric method of torture would often never recover and would suffer permanent damage for the rest of their life. It was the quickest way to get a confession from someone, whether they were guilty or not. Due to the speed that people would confess, it was only used for hours at a time, rather than over a period of days. Another brutal method of torture was the wheel. It was often called the Catherine wheel, and it is one of the most notorious forms of torture used during the Spanish Inquisition. Not only was it a form of torture, but it was also used as a type of entertainment for those that could watch. The mechanics of the wheel were similar to the rack, but were more often than not, it was used more to create pain and suffering before eventually leading to death, rather than torturing for a forced confession. The most common wheel used for this method was from an old wagon. The prisoner would then be stretched across the wheel and tied down by each limb. They would then be beaten severely with clubs, bats and other instruments that would cause damage to the body. The gaps in the wheels were targeted, as this made it easier to shatter bones into pieces, causing agonizing pain. This was all done in front of large crowds of people, and as you can imagine, no one wanted to experience that spectacle, so it was a great deterrence to the people of Spain. The Spanish Inquisition also saw the use of waterboarding and other torture methods using water. Multiple techniques were used to make sure that the person being punished felt like they were drowning over and over again. The technique used often depended on the area in Spain that had been conquered. One method included laying the accused on their back with their ankles and legs strapped to a board. This took away the person's ability to fight back, which they would often do when panic struck them and they couldn't breathe. A piece of cloth would then be put into their mouths, and water would be poured over their mouth. This tactic was used over and over and repeated over a number of days, until the person struggled to breathe normally. The victims would struggle to catch their breath in between pause, and if a confession could not be gained, then the length of time pouring water would be longer and longer. The break to catch a breath would also get shorter and shorter, increasing the intensity of the torture until death occurred or a confession was gained. Those having this inflicted upon them would lose consciousness before ultimately dying due to the water slowly filling up their lungs. This made the threat of water torture alone often enough to gain a confession, guilty or not. Many people admitted to crimes that they did not commit under duress, just to stop the torture. There were hundreds of miscarriages of justice. Many of the accused were innocent of all alleged crime, but were executed regardless, due to not being allowed to defend themselves.
Please comment, like and subscribe if you wish for more stories, and leave your suggestions below and I will endeavour to cover them.